I'm Laura London, and this is the December 2025 edition of Speaking of Jung. Returning to us today for episode 152 is Jungian scholar, writer, and professor Paul Bishop in Glasgow, Scotland. After graduating from the College of St. Mary Magdalen at the University of Oxford, he spent a year as a DAAD Scholar at the DLA Marbach before entering the doctoral program at Oxford's Faculty of Medieval and Modern Languages. He was awarded the Lady Julia Henry Fellowship at Harvard University and spent a year as the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung Fellow at Marbach. He graduated with a Ph.D. from Oxford in 1994 with the dissertation C.G. Jung's Reception of Friedrich Nietzsche, later published as the book The Dionysian Self. For 12 years, he held the position of Professor of German at the University of Glasgow, and in 2013 was named the William Jacks Chair in Modern Languages at the university's School of Modern Languages and Cultures, where he currently serves as an Honorary Professorial Research Fellow. Professor Bishop's most recent books include Discourses of Philology and Theology in Nietzsche, and Nietzsche's Writing Against Religion and the Crisis of Faith. He has contributed chapters to such recent publications as Ideas and Influences on Eranos, Self-Optimization in Modernist Culture, and Where is Soul? Psychology in Modernity, co-edited by episode 33 guest Pamela Power. His current project is a 4-volume series of studies for Chiron Publications, examining the great canonical texts that exercised a decisive influence on the development of analytical psychology and the thought of C.G. Jung. The first 2 volumes, on Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival, discussed in episode 135, and on Goethe's Faust, the subject of this episode, have been published. And in the pipeline are books on Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra and, rounding off the series, a study of the Red Book, seen as a contribution to the tradition we can call the Epic of Transformation. At this year's Congress of the International Association for Analytical Psychology, known as the IAAP, Professor Bishop was awarded honorary membership. And a few weeks ago, he was presented with a commemorative stone of this very prestigious honor while visiting Copenhagen to teach a class on the Red Book at the Jung Institute of Denmark. You can read an interview with Professor Bishop and IAAP President, Jungian analyst Mr. Berg, in their November 2025 news bulletin. Professor Bishop joins us after these words. Speaking of Jung is a listener-supported show. So please, if you're listening, consider joining our Patreon for just $5 a month, and you will receive access to all of my research notes for each episode. If you don't use Patreon, please visit our support page at speakingofjung.com/support for all the additional ways you can help keep us going. And please be sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel. It's free and it helps us to get more exposure. I am also here to remind you of the importance of recording your dreams. Temenos Stream is a revolutionary dream tracking app available for iOS and Android. Now you can record your dreams by speaking into your phone or typing them into the app. Search for myths, legends, and fairy tales related to the themes in your dreams. Use the new advanced AI interpretation with a focus on Jung's work to look closely at symbols and associations, to consider the shadow, anima, animus, archetypes, and much more. Simply download the app and create a free account. Unlimited use is available with a premium subscription. Click on the link in the description box below or on our website, speakingofjung.com, where you will find links to everything discussed in this episode in the show notes. This video interview is being recorded on Wednesday, December 10th, 2025, through the magic of StreamYard. Hi, Professor Bishop.
Well, hello, Laura. Hi there. Thank you very much, and pleasure to be with you again.
So it's great to see you again. Thank you so much for returning to Speaking of Jung. It is such a pleasure and an honor to have you here. And before we begin by discussing Faust, which was very important to Jung, I would like to congratulate you again on receiving an honorary membership to the IAAP. And if you'd like to say a few words about that, I would love to hear.
Well, thank you very much, Laura. Actually, the honour is all mine to be here on your wonderful show. An honour too was to be awarded this really very, very fetching honorary membership. Very touched by that. Very grateful to the IAAP for the support that it's given my work over the years. It's been a great forum for me to do my research, do my thinking about Jung, and it's really very much appreciated. And I should be thanking them rather than them giving me stones, but it's absolutely beautiful, and I'm chuffed to bits. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to go public and say that, because it means a great deal to me. It means a great deal to me to be with you and talking about Goethe's Faust.
Well, thank you so much. And as I mentioned in the introduction, you did do an interview with the then IAAP president, Mr. Berg, and it's a wonderful interview, and thank you for the mention. And the PDF is available online, and I'll provide a link to that in the show notes.
Yeah, please do that, because Mr. had some great questions. So it was really good to do that with her.
Well, I learned more about you, things that I wasn't aware of, which I appreciated knowing. This is our 4th episode together, but we tend not to talk about you. You've written so many books. I think she said that you've written over 30 books. Is that true?
I try not to count, but I've tried to be busy, and I've always tried to use the opportunities that I have. And Glasgow University has one of the great research libraries of the UK, probably in Europe as well. It's an absolutely fabulous resource, and having that on one's doorstep, I've always enjoyed using the library. And without it, I couldn't have done the work that I've done.
Well, you have an extraordinary body of work, and now I'm going to be creating a page in our blog dedicated to you. We have one on Murray Stein and on J. Gary Sparks and on the collected works of Marie-Louise von Franz and some others. And your huge body of work warrants its own page on Speaking of Jung's website. Okay. So I'll be creating that.
Well, so thank you very much.
Oh, yeah, you're very welcome. And we're here today to discuss Volume 2 in this series. When did we do the first episode? That was sometime last year or earlier this year?
No, it was. I think it was about this time last year when we looked at Wolfram von Eschenbach and Parzifal. We had a brief excursus looking at flying saucers in the meantime, and now we're meeting again to talk about Volume 2. So we're halfway through the series. That's the good news, folks. 2 down, 2 to go. So the end is in sight.
Well, as I had mentioned, that you telling me about this series was one of the motivating factors in me bringing Speaking of Jung back, because I had told you that I wanted to do episodes about it, and I felt like I didn't want to break that promise. And also I have a tremendous amount of interest in what you've done here, taking on these texts that were so important to Jung. So we are here to focus on the connection with Jung. And so let's start with why you chose Goethe's Faust to be in this series that you've written titled Jung and the Epic of Transformation. Why Faust?
Yeah, great. No, great question. Great starting point. And I'm glad that Speaking of Jung is going, because it's trying to do the same thing as I'm wanting to do as well, which is to get people interested in Jung and make the connections and understand this immense intellectual legacy that Jung's left us. And I think part of that intellectual legacy is tied up with his identification with Goethe, this legend that he talks about him being biologically related, I would take as a code for his deep intellectual kinship with Goethe. He keeps on referring to Goethe and Faust in particular at all points in the 20 volumes of the collected works. Some very significant discussions in the correspondence that's been published to date as well. And I think we'd be no exaggeration to say that Goethe is the single most important thinker for Jung as he came to develop the project of analytical psychology. And I think that as we read Goethe, so we understand better Jung, but conversely too, Jung can also help us understand the vast, I think there's something about 143 volumes in the Weimarer Ausgabe of Goethe, help us to come to terms with a thinker who is perhaps undervalued in the English-speaking world, and in some respects difficult to access. But Jung is a great key, I think, to unlocking what Goethe is about. And similarly, if we understand what Goethe is doing, we can see how Jung is part of this legacy as well.
So you mentioned, I don't want that to slip through the cracks, you mentioned the legend that Jung was related to Goethe. Now, he mentions that in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, but where I first learned about that was in my favorite book. My go-to is C.G. Jung, Word and Image.
Right.
And I will pop up some photos here on the screen as I speak about this a little bit. So this is on page 11 in that book that Anila Yaffe edited the book, and she writes, one should not ascribe too much significance to this little great-grandfather legend. However, Jung's references to it are generally characterized by a playful tone. What was more important was Jung's sense of a spiritual affinity to Goethe. So I should have mentioned that Jung's paternal grandfather, who they call Carl Jung the First, is rumored to be an illegitimate son of Goethe. So not to be gossipy, but that is significant, right? And you seem to tend to not see that literally. I think it's true.
It could be true. Maybe it is true. But is that what matters? Would be my point, because it seems to me, and the fact that Jung says it with a kind of twinkle in his eye, seems to me part of that legend, that it's a way of articulating, I would say, affiliation, a sonship, a kinship. It's a way of him saying, I am so very, very close to Goethe, but he's also doing it in a way which typically for Jung is playful, is ludic, is not going in there being very, very heavy, but is a way of saying, I feel an enormous kinship with this writer. And in terms of the terminology that he uses in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he can see an important link between the personality number 2, as he talks about it, and Goethe and Goethe's Faust. So I would see it as its importance residing in this way that Goethe helps Jung formulate his ideas, and it's also done in a very powerful way, because it's not simply the kinship between Jung and Goethe, it's the kinship that Jung feels between himself and Faust. And of course, Faust is a literary figure, a fictional figure, quasi-historical figure. That doesn't mean that he isn't a real figure, but I'd say that the more important connection could be true, couldn't be, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But it isn't the biological connection, it's the intellectual one. And deeper than that, it's the emotional one as well. And when Jung says, in the figure of Faust, I found something that told me about myself, that for me is where the significance resides. But there may be other resonances in there as well, that's true.
Well, that's debatable, and maybe we'll save that for another time, whether or not Jung's grandfather was the illegitimate son of Goethe. So
we need the DNA tests done on that one.
We need the DNA tests, and also it's making me think of something that came up in the last episode I did, which was I brought back the show Speaking with Laura, which is a spinoff of Speaking of Jung, because I wanted to be able to kind of carry on the quarantine edition where I interviewed people who are not Jungian analysts and not even necessarily talk about Jung, but there's always a connection with Jung. And I just did an episode on Jung's birth chart with a Hermetic astrologer. And he said, what if it is literal? And I love that because that's how I am. I do tend to look at things literally. That's the first place I go. So I do think that it is possible that this is something literal, which doesn't mean that it's not also these other things, spiritual and emotional and intellectual. But where we need to go next is, how did Jung discover Goethe and Faust and this connection? So where did that begin?
Well, it's interesting. We're obviously having to rely on what Jung tells us in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and now in the volume Jung's Life and Work. So we do have these accounts that are given there, and I think it's significant that in both times, in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and Jung's Life and Work, Jung says it was his mother that drew his attention to Goethe's Faust. I mean, he's 15 years old in one version, 16 years old in another. So an older child, but someone who is going through an intellectual and emotional flourishing at that time. And out of the blue, we're told his mother. And there's all the fascinating stories around Jung's mother, of course, says, have you read Goethe's Faust? He hasn't. He goes off and reads it and is absolutely gripped by what he finds. And I think one could say without any exaggeration that he spends the rest of his life trying to come to terms with what he finds in this encounter with the figure of Faust. He says, actually, the Faust figure, important as he was, even he wasn't as important as Mephisto was, Mephistopheles, the devil figure in Goethe's version of the story, and there is an important link, he says, between Mephistopheles and the realm of the mothers, and we're already taken here into parts of plot detail about part one of Faust, the mother scene in part two of Faust. It's this incredible interweaving between what we find him saying and what we find him then developing in his ideas, in his analytical psychology. That seems to me is where the connection lies. But it all goes back to his mother. It always goes back to the mother, doesn't it?
Great point. Wow. That's really heavy. And you get into it in detail throughout this book. And I do have a question. I wonder, why would Jung's mother suggest such a heavy story, right? Yeah. Such a strange, and how would you describe Faust? I mean, it's filled with the themes that it's filled with, death and lust and all sorts.
You might say perfect
to a 15-year-old kid.
Yeah, well, you might say that's the perfect combination. It's better than going off and playing games or whatever, I suppose. One very good reason might be that Goethe's Faust is in many ways the German dramatic poetic text. It is more canonical than anything else in the canon as far as German writing is concerned. And you're absolutely right that there is all the stuff about murder, the seduction of Gretchen. You've got the mysticism of the mothers. You've got the murder of Philemon and Baucis. It is an incredible text. And it's also an incredible fact that it's this text which has this extraordinary status within German culture. So I think you could also look at it as a way of Jung acknowledging the way that he was brought up at home, in his family, with his father's library, at school, at university, with the great thinkers of German culture, with Goethe, with Kant, with Nietzsche. I'm thinking of those passages in his autobiographical writings where he recalls how Jakob Burckhardt and Johann Jakob Backhofen were the friends of Nietzsche were wandering. You'd see them wandering around Basel. And I think for this, it's useful for this to show us just how steeped Jung was in the German intellectual tradition. But he's not just doing it as an intellectual historian, he's also doing it as something where he feels viscerally involved with it as well. And to me, that's one of the things that marks out Jung's genius is the high-level intellectual connection, but also the deep, dark, emotional, archetypal, if you will, stuff that's there as well.
Mm-hmm.
So his mother it was a shrewd recommendation for her to give her son.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the Epic of Transformation. So that is the title of this series of books.
Okay.
So transformation is really, I think, your focus, has been throughout the first 2 volumes.
Yeah.
And that Faust is the ultimate in transformative figures.
Yeah.
So why did you choose this? You must have been thinking about this series for a very long time before you embarked. What got your attention on the topic of transformation?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I suppose a lot of it had been there, building up as I was going around doing various other things and so on. But the roots of it, Laura, actually came during the lockdown and COVID, where I'm spending a lot of time at home, obviously. But it also seemed to be that it was a time which made you think, well, what is it that really matters? And going back and rereading the canon seemed to be a good way of responding to the peculiar historical moment that one found oneself being part of, and that's also, I think, what I've tried to do in my teaching and research is to allow people to connect with the great books. They are the great books: Parsifal, Zarathustra, Faust. They're incredible texts, and I think it's a shame that their canonical status has sometimes pushed people away from appreciating them because they think, well, it's too difficult, or I won't understand it, or it's not for me, or whatever. And I think that Jung's response is so strong that it ought to make us all feel, well, maybe there's something in these texts for me as well. And I think what makes them particularly relevant today is this motif, and boy, is it there in Goethe's Faust, this motif of transformation. Of how does one move from one situation into another and hopefully a better one? How does one gain that totality that Schiller talks about? How do we, Nietzsche calls it the Übermensch, how do we overcome ourselves and enter into this new quality of being, which it seems to me is an eminently apt way of describing what Jungian therapy is about. So it was during the COVID time that I started working on this project, and if that was the limitations of lockdown, gave me the opportunity to start fleshing out how these volumes would work. It was the idea of transformation that we were all hoping for in the post-COVID world. I remember at the time we were told that we were entering a new future and we'd never go back to things the way they were. Well, hasn't quite worked out like that, but that doesn't mean that the project of transformation is wrong. It just means we haven't really begun on the project of transformation.
Great point. And you mentioned the word canon a lot, the literary canon, and the question, does the literary canon still exist? And my question is, who decides on what gets included in this canon? And is the canon used to what? Influence our thinking, control the masses? What do you have to say about the canon?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Laura, to pull me up on that, because it is a contested term, both by those who would see it as a kind of tool of social control. You have to read these texts, and we're going to decide what you read, and so that kind of totalitarian aspect. But I think there's also another side of it, which is, well, who creates the canon? Well, the canon creates itself. It's what's the body of writing to which people refer, and to which to which people then refer to the references. So you build up a tradition of interpretation, of reception, and it's out of that the canon emerges. So Plato isn't important because people go around saying, well, you've got to read Plato. It's because out of Plato we have the flourishing of idealism. We have all sorts of important political notions. We have a theory of what it means to be just. Those are things that make Plato important. What is it that makes Goethe important is, well, over and above what he does as a historical figure, when German literature is acquiring its full identity, is that he's been read by so many people who've been influenced by him, like Jung, whom we're talking about, and that canonicity emerges out of that engagement with the text. So I would see the canon as not about what we decide. In a way, it's the canonicity arises out of a body of reflection and interpretation, and trying to understand what these great books are on about. And in a way, that's a question that never ends.
So I think that we should go over briefly a synopsis of the story.
Right.
And the story of Faust is in two parts, and they were written separately. So if you would, I know, so this is a show, so we've have to summarize things, and then you go into great detail in the book, which would, we'd love for everybody to get a copy of the book and read the book. So it was released by Chiron Publications in October, and it is available in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle. And there will be links in the show notes. It's available on Amazon, or you can get it directly from Chiron Publications. So just to give people a context if they haven't read it, or I actually, before I read your book, I saw Faust performed at the Santa Fe Opera in 2011. Pretty rare. From when I told you about that, you said that was not a common thing.
Yeah.
So it was extraordinary, and there were subtitles you had to read on a little screen in front of you, but the theatrical production, and the Santa Fe Opera House is open air in the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Anyway, so
sounds beautiful.
It just was so dramatic, and such a production. So give us, if you would, a synopsis of parts 1 and part 2.
Okay, sure. Now it is quite a challenge. Part 1's pretty okay. It's part 2 where it all gets rather wild. But we start off in part 1 with the figure of Dr. Faustus. It's a historical figure, quasi-historical figure that Goethe picks up from the Germanic tradition. And he gives this figure a very distinct contour. It's a middle-aged academic basically undergoing a midlife crisis. Faust is there lamenting that for all that he's learned, he hasn't actually got any further in understanding how the world works. So there is an epistemological crisis that Faust is going through. There's also an emotional one, because as we'll see, he's a kind of sad bachelor figure as well. And because the orthodox means of learning about the world haven't delivered for him, he decides to turn to the magic side and calls up spirits, and it doesn't work. But we can see that he's on the edge of breaking through into another dimension.
So I'm going to interrupt you right here.
Yeah.
Because we want to associate this with Jung.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump in with
Absolutely.
Jungian themes. So the first one is a midlife crisis, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. But and keeping in mind that Jung read this when he was 15 years old. And I'm just, it's reading your book, it's fascinating to see how much of an influence Goethe's Faust had on Jung. Okay, so that's the first thing, a midlife crisis.
So we've got the midlife crisis. The story as a whole of Faust Part 1 has the three introductions, this kind of threefold framework that's put round of it. one of which is a dedicatory poem, second of which is a conversation between actors and managers about how to put on productions, and the third one, the most important one, is the prologue in heaven, where we get a kind of reworking through of the story of Job. Big link to Jung there, of course, as well, with Answer to Job,
yep.
1952. And instead of Job being the figure that's going to be tempted by Satan or by Mephisto, it's going to be Dr. Faust. But it's interesting that we have a wager right in this framing device of the prologue in heaven, which sets up the story of Faust being tempted by the figure of the devil, by the figure of Mephisto. And so when Mephisto, whom he first sees as a black dog running around, comes into his study room, Faust engages on this pact with the devil. He engages on this pact with Mephisto, but in order to do what? Well, it isn't simply, as in some older versions of the story, to get the guns, the girls, and the gold, as C.S. Lewis put it. It's something much deeper than that. There's this wonderful line in the prologue where the Lord God says, "Es irrt der Mensch, solange er strebt." A human being will make mistakes as long as they are striving. And we're going to, and the whole of the Faust Part 1 and Part 2 is really about this striving and the exercise of that striving, which is given its kind of demonic boost through the pact with Mephisto. But Mephisto himself doesn't really understand what Faust wants. What Faust really wants, he says, is to know what holds everything together. He wants to know how the world in all its various ways works. So there's a great quotation from Jung himself when he gives us a very apt description about Faust Part 1, where he says that Faust has to learn to put away his scholar's gown, bid farewell to his study, and wander with human heart through the world, because it's there in the horrors of prisons, lunatic asylums and hospitals, in drab suburban pubs, in brothels and gambling hells, in the salons of the elegant, the stock exchanges, socialist meetings, churches, revivalist gatherings, and ecstatic sects, Jung says, it's through love and hate, through the experience of passion in every form in his own body, and that's what Faust wants, and that's why the Gretchen story is tied up and part and parcel of this, he says. This means if we embark on this Faustian path, that a psychologist will reap richer stores of knowledge than textbooks a foot thick could give him. And that is really the dynamic which is being played out in Goethe's Faust Part 1. We have the crisis of knowledge, the crisis of epistemology, but also this emotional crisis, which is worked out in the story of his seduction of Gretchen. And if we want to, one of the ways that we can understand Faust Part 1 and 2 is as a sequence of anima figures. That's the way that Jung talks about it.
That's so Jung right there. His issues, if you will, with the anima, with his anima.
With his anima, that's why it's you can see these kinds of connections that are happening at all levels between Jung and Goethe and Goethe's. I mean, leaving aside the complicated question about Goethe's relationships with women, but there in the story of the seduction of Gretchen, we have one of the most emotionally impactful parts of Faust Part 1. What can this poor girl do when she's up against a man who is literally in league with the devil? And it's this relationship which leads to her destruction, and that already shows, I think, just how morally questionable Faust is, and yet he's the hero.
So this is Part 1, right? Yeah. And we see a lot of Jungian themes. Mm-hmm. And when I say Jungian, I mean pertaining to Carl Gustav Jung. Yeah. But it's also reminding me of something in your book, which is that kind of we're all Faust.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So we'll get to that.
Great.
So it's just okay. So Part 2.
Part 2 is where a lot of people think it's all got out of control.
And let me just ask you, why the gap between Parts 1 and Part 2?
Well, yeah, interesting. It's partly explicable, I think, through the fact that Faust really, the writing of Faust, the composition of Faust really accompanies Goethe throughout the whole of his life as well. In fact, he talks about it as being his main business, his Hauptgeschäft. It's a phrase that Jung picks up and applies to his own work as well. And why does it take Goethe so much time? Well, because it is a work of such immense complexity, and one might say that it's the story of Goethe's life itself, which is being worked out in dramatic form. That's the line that critics like A.N. Wilson, who's published a new biography of Goethe, that makes a very strong case for us seeing the composition of Faust as being a kind of accompaniment to Goethe throughout his entire life. And in fact, he only puts the final finishing touches to Faust Part 2 in 1832, a few days before he dies. So it's a work which literally he accompanies him throughout his life.
Did he intend on writing a Part 2?
I think that, well, he pre-wrote what is now Act 3 in the form of a drama called The Helena. So Part 2, and Helena, there we are. We've got another anima figure, the great anima figure. I mean, the anima figure that set all the ships off to Troy, and so on. So he's working in bits of it. It's really only pulled together in the last stage of his life. And some critics might say, well, it's pulled together in the loosest of senses, because whereas we have a very clear plot, well, I hope it was clear from what I'm saying, in Faust Part 1, in Part 2, we really leave this world and go, in some cases, literally out of space and time. Mm-hmm. We're into the realm of romantic ideas. We're into the realm of ancient mythology. Let me just run you through the 5 acts there.
Okay.
Act 1 of Part 2, we see Faust recovering. Well, he's recovering. Poor old Gretchen is looking forward to her execution, and he, in league with the devil, starts to work for the emperor, who is Bust. There's a lot of economic themes which emerge at this stage. There's a great carnival, and Faust also is tasked, moving on from Act 1 into Act 2, with bringing up the shade, the ghost of Helena and Paris from the underworld. And so in the mother's scene, Faust is told the way how to gain access to, well, the afterlife, the underworld, in order to bring back these figures, which he does, but is only partially successful in doing. In Act 2, we shift again, and move into a different part of Western culture. We see the figure of the homunculus being created in a retort, and this very modern technological motif is accompanied by a move back into mythology in the classical Walpurgis Night, which is a kind of answer to an extension of the Walpurgis Night of part 1. I told you it was complicated. It's incredibly complicated. In Act 3, which used to be the Helena Act, we see Helen and Faust having an affair. So we see the old world and the new world coming together, having a son called Euphorion, often associated with the figure of Byron. In Act 4, the emperor that we saw in Act 1 is now at war. We have the theme of war and international relations addressed. And then we come to Part 5, which has the murder of Philemon and Baucis, the old couple whose death upset Jung so much. Faust himself dies. He makes a kind of confession that we might want to look at in more detail towards the end of the play.
Yeah.
Even when he dies, that isn't the end of the play, because in the final scene, Mountain Gorges, we see Faust, the man who has murdered, who has seduced, who has always striven and been concentrated on himself. Whereas in the traditional Faust story, he was condemned to hell. In Goethe's version, he is redeemed. He's taken up to heaven, and the final words of the mystical chorus invoke the eternal feminine, and there we come to an end. It's an incredible work. I can't recommend it highly enough. There's a great edition in the Norton Critical Edition series, which gives you all the mythological references. It's a text which is eminently modern in its themes and in expression, but it is also reaching back to the mythological past and bringing that into our present world. I can't recommend it highly enough. It's a fantastic work.
You said the Norton Critical Edition?
That's right. Yeah. Edited by Cyrus Hamlin and in the translation by Walter Arndt.
Again, the themes in this story influencing him. And was there anything else that was written that he could have read that had similar themes? I mean, obviously your other books, but these not similar themes. So I guess I'm asking these specific themes.
Yeah. Well, yes, Goethe is part of an intellectual conversation in his time that Jung would have been aware of about the nature of mythology. Let me just cite one figure. Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling is part of this, who German idealist writer who writes a lot about mythology. We know that Jung had read Schelling as well, and we know that Goethe and Schelling had an intellectual exchange. There was a big debate that was going on in Goethe's time about how to understand mythology. How did it come to being? Was it a product of primitive thinking, and therefore something to be condemned, as opposed to the logical rationality, the emphasis on the logos that one finds in Christianity? Or was it as a kind of poetic writing enabled to give us access to another dimension? And I think you can see that those are questions which are very Jungian questions as well. And it's not for nothing that Jung and those who write in the Jungian tradition have recourse to mythology. I just pick one example out of many, the work that's been done on Orpheus. These thinkers went back to the myths, and they found in them not just something of antiquarian interest. They found it as something which is of modern powerful significance for them. And Terence Dawson, in his book on Orpheus, I think shows why that myth is still important for us today. There's a little bit of Orpheus that's there in part 2, but almost every aspect of mythology that you can think about, the Homeric wars, the figures of the sirens, the figures of the sphinxes. Almost everything is packed into this work. It's also a work where Goethe is having a lot of fun, pulling all of these various things together. And I think he had a very telling phrase, I think, Laura, which I think is really the key to it, is he speaks about Faust as being these very serious jokes, these very serious jests, diese sehr ernsten Scherze. And I think the idea of these very serious jokes is a great way of describing it. Yes, it's a wonderful canonical work and so on, but there is also humor, there is vitality. It's a little lesson in itself. And I think, as you're bringing out, so much of this anticipates, would have helped guide Jung on his way to writing his own version of Faust, let's put it like that, which Jung does when he's working on the Red Book. That's what I'm going to try and argue in Volume 4.
In Volume 4, right. So I clearly have not read the original Faust parts 1 and 2. I kept saying parts 1 and part 2. I meant part 1 and part 2, or parts 1 and 2. I clearly have not read the original German, the whole thing start to finish, which you have. Mm-hmm. So are you saying that it's funny, it's comical, it's this serious story that's littered with kind of humor?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's an unperformable play. I mean, one of the few people who put it on are the Steinerians, people of the school of Steiner, the anthroposophists at Dornach, where they, as I understand, perform it using their eurythmic techniques. But it's virtually unstageable. That in itself makes the work a kind of a joke, right? I mean, you know, that nobody's going to have time over an entire weekend to see this work being performed. But because it's unperformable, that doesn't stop it being a great work, either in terms of the range of mythology that's cited and brought in, nor the figure of Mephisto. On the one hand, he's the devil. On the other hand, he's a clever little devil, because he's always given a few jokey remarks at the end, even at the prologue in Heaven. At many other points in the play, Mephisto turns to the audience, as it were, turns to the reader, and with a wink makes a ribald remark about what we've just seen being performed. And I think the Goethe is absolutely right. We can be serious about things, and we can also have a sense of humor about them. And in fact, maybe that's one of the things that we've lost today, is how to have a sense of humor about serious things. And Goethe is a great antidote to that.
I bring that up because, as I had mentioned to you in an email, another one of my introductions to Goethe was in the television series that I often mention, Northern Exposure.
Yeah.
And in season 4, episode 18, titled Northern Lights, Chris Stevens, the character of Chris Stevens, quotes Goethe.
Goethe's final words, more light. Ever since we crawled out of that primordial slime, that's been our unifying cry, more light.
My connection is that Northern Exposure, 6 seasons, 110 episodes, was considered a drama, but was really a comedy. And it was very Jungian. That's why I talk about it. And one of the story editors, I think the main story editor, his mother was a Jungian analyst, the late Mary Margaret Brummel, in Boston. So where was I going with this? That these I learned so much about mythology and philosophy from watching Northern Exposure, which started in 1990. But these themes can be delivered with humor, and also the human condition is quite, to me, absurd and comical.
Yeah.
So I think that that got my attention. But there are a bunch of other things too here that I don't want to let slip through the cracks. And one of them is, you had asked, why does Jung describe Goethe as becoming for him a prophet?
Yeah. It's interesting that he makes this remark on a couple of occasions in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. One of the first ones, I think, where this takes place is in his description of how his mother alerts him to Faust. And he says, well, what I saw in Mephisto, he says, was a kind of archetypal figure of evil. He says, Mephisto attracted me, caught my attention, and it connected him with this question of, what is good, what is evil, and it's both a moral question, but it's also a personal one for him as well. What he says in Memories, Dream, Reflection is at last I'd found confirmation, when he reads Faust, that there were or had been people who saw evil and its universal power, and, more important, and here comes the really Jungian bit, the mysterious role it played in delivering man from darkness and suffering. So we've already got there, you can see the themes that are going to preoccupy him with the correspondence with Victor White. To that extent, says Jung, Goethe became, in my eyes, a prophet. So this deep theological question, Jung's not the first person to think about it, but he's certainly one of the most important ones in the 20th century. See, what's going on in Goethe's Faust is a kind of framework for dealing with this key problem, which doesn't go away, and it doesn't go away, least of all in the 20th century. And he says later on in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he says, the work Faust struck a chord in me and pierced me through. Very Wolfram von Eschenbachian language there, pierced me through in a way that I could not but regard as personal, because it awakened in me the problem of opposites, of good and evil, of mind and matter, of light and darkness. And Jung says, my own inner contradictions appeared here in dramatized form. Goethe had risen virtually a basic outline and pattern of my own conflicts and solutions. Well, the conflicts, I think we've already touched on them in various ways. But what are the solutions? Well, again, it's presented in a very Goethean way. Later, says Jung, I consciously linked my work, analytical psychology, to what Faust had passed over. And here they go with these three things: respect for the eternal rights of humankind, recognition of the ancient, and the continuity of culture and intellectual history. And it seems to me that is a great way of summarizing the program of analytical psychology, and it's expressly linked to what's there in Goethe.
Hang on,
Faust has in the form of Faust, not the person, but Faust, the work, making available to us. Because at the end, the joke is on the devil. In the end, Faust is redeemed and is saved. So for all of this concern with the problem of evil and its mysterious power, we're also dealing with a kind of response to theology. It is the ultimate theological joke for Faust, this great archetypal sinner, to be saved. And why he's saved is tied up with the final insights that he gains in Act 5, just before he dies, where he moves away from wanting to run throughout the world, pursuing his own ideas, his own ambitions. He understands that his Streben, his striving, whilst legitimate, has a limit, and it's that which is, one might say, the saving grace, the saving insight, and which moves him into an entirely different dynamic, an entirely different relationship to the world, and that's indexed to the figure of Sophia, that's indexed to the figure of the eternal feminine who draws Faust up on high. But going back to your point about we are all Faust, in the final line says, Das ewig Weibliche zieht uns hinan. The eternal feminine draws us always onwards.
Draws us always onwards.
Yeah, onwards and upwards. That's the very final part that we read of Faust Part 2.
Wow. I wonder how many times Jung read Faust start to finish. Such a huge influence on him.
I think once you start to see the connections, you realize that it's more than a casual quotation, but also that the issues that we find Goethe being concerned with in Faust are in that little passage which I was quoting a moment ago. And Jung's a great explainer of texts. And I think that he doesn't simply make a quotational use of Goethe and Goethe's Faust, but rather he's absolutely right that there is something key to what both men are trying to do. And I would say, and I would say this, wouldn't I, that it's all related to this theme of transformation, and that just as Faust is trying to transform himself and is at the end transformed, that's the great genius of the final Mountain Gorges scene, where Goethe is pulling on all the various art historical levers, references to Dante in order to create a kind of cultural heaven into which Faust is taken up. So it's there with Jung as well, and this great adventure, which he calls individuation, where we are trying to integrate those different parts of the personality, and in so doing, produce something which is qualitatively new, different, richer, more total, in the way, to use the language borrowed from Schiller that Jung talks about to describe himself.
Mm-hmm. So, just for the listeners, when you say Faustus, you mean Faust. And what is the difference there between you? When would one use Faustus and use Faust?
I think when we talk about the chapbooks, the puppet plays as Faust or Faustus, it's just the kind of Latin version of the.
Okay, so it's just a different version of the name Faust.
Absolutely, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And of course, the most famous version that people know about is in the English-speaking world is the version by Christopher Marlowe, which has a wonderful scene at the end where Faustus is waiting for the time to run out and for Mephisto to come and haul him off to hell. That's completely reversed. I mean, and that is the ultimate orthodox statement of the Faustus legend. And what Goethe does is to entirely invert that by having the figure of the devil himself seduced by little putti who distract him, and Faust, who is taken up to heaven accompanied by the figure of a penitent who is Gretchen. There is a great wrapping up together of all the various themes and figures that we've encountered in the play, and as it were, it all fits into the salvation of this man who makes mistakes, the man who makes big mistakes. And there are issues of gender which inform our reception of it today. That probably more than the theological one becomes difficult for us. But I think that we can see that what Goethe is trying to do is to overcome these binary opposites of gender, and it's the eternal feminine that wins out at the end. It's Sophia and Sophia's grace that rescues Faust, not what Faust himself has done. Faust is only saved when he stops his striving. So absolutely, there's a gender aspect, but it is the grace of Sophia which triumphs rather than the patriarchal, hyper-masculine striving for world domination, which we find in the figure of Faust. So I'd see it as a very, very feminist work in some ways.
Wow, that was a great summary, actually. And then I wanted to just be clear, when you say Mephisto, you're referring to Mephistopheles.
That's right.
Who was not the actual devil, but one of, as Miguel Connor said, one of his henchmen.
That's right. I think Goethe chooses the name. I mean, say Mephisto just because it's otherwise such a
Okay.
But he's clearly an analogous figure to Satan in the Book of Job. So whether it's the devil with the big D or Satan with a big S or a small s, it's evil and it's henchman in various forms. Miguel's absolutely right about that.
Another connection that Jung makes, or reference that Jung makes to Goethe's Faust, is in a letter published in Volume 1 of C.G. Jung Letters to Dr. Max Richtner, dated 28th February 1932. And that letter is Jung's response to a series of questions, a questionnaire that Dr. Richtner sent to several different people. And Jung answers the questions. And I actually was so taken by it that I created a Twitter post, and I posted the entire letter on Twitter yesterday, which was December 9th. I'll provide a link to it in the show notes. So why was that significant? Or what did you get out of Jung's, it was specifically on the importance of Goethe's Faust?
Yeah, that's absolutely right, and it's a great letter to draw my attention to, Laura. It's interesting that I'm just going to tuck in the fact that he says that as a poet, Jung says he's very interested in Hölderlin.
Yes.
So, that's another whole different topic, but fascinating for what he says about Faust. He says everything else of Goethe's pales beside Faust, although something immortal glitters in the poems too. So we can take from that Jung was familiar with the broad spectrum of Goethe's writing, which is huge. I mean, he's a poet, he is a playwright, he is a natural scientist. There's something called Goethean science. There's a very interesting allusion to how Goethe said he was able to see the development of plant in his imagination. That's quoted in Jung's medical thesis on occultism. And picking up on what we were just talking about, I think it's interesting to see that Jung says, what one could enjoy of Goethe is for me too patriarchal, too much de l'époque, he says. What I value in Goethe, I cannot enjoy. It's too big, too exciting, too profound. And then there's an astonishing passage where talk about what the canon is and how it's formed. Well, here we find what Jung sees as the canon. Faust, he says, is the most recent pillar in that bridge of the spirit which spans the morass of world history, beginning with the Gilgamesh epic, and we think about the importance of Is-Dubar for the Red Book, the I Ching, no need to say any more about that for Jungians, the Upanishads, the Tao Te Ching, the fragments of Heraclitus, the thinker of the turning around, the metamorphic moment where things turn around, and continuing in the Gospel of St. John that he describes as almost a kind of counterpoint to Faust in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, the letters of St. Paul in Meister Eckhart, so many connections there, of course, and in Dante, well, we talked about that in relation to part 2. And then he goes on to say, it seems to me that one cannot meditate enough about Faust. I think that's an interesting way of talking about him. It's a text for meditation. It's almost a kind of new scripture. You can't meditate enough about Faust, for many of the mysteries of the second part are still unfathomed. And I think there's a kind of humility there, which he says, well, I don't understand all of part 2, Faust part 2 either. And of course, if Jung doesn't get it, what chance do the rest of us have? He says, Faust is out of this world, and therefore it transports you. It is as much the future as the past, and therefore the most living present. And I think that's a beautiful passage of praise for Goethe's Faust, but it's also very insightful about how Faust can transport us and how, because it is dealing with the future as the past, it makes the most living present. And it seems to me that that's a very Jungian quality, to look for vitality, to look at myth, not just in terms of something which is antiquarian and relating to the past, but a bit like the little Corinthian collar, which is buried away in the modern city at the beginning of transformations and symbols of libido. It's there and feeds into our modern sensibility as well.
Another aspect of Goethe's Faust and its connection with Jung that we haven't touched on is the topic of alchemy.
Yeah.
And that Faust is said to be, quote, an alchemical drama.
Yeah.
And that's in Jung's Collected Works, Volume 12, that he refers to it as an alchemical drama. So how is Faust, the story of Faust, alchemical?
Great question, and there've been some great attempts to read the unfolding of the drama of Faust in alchemical terms. I'll just name one because there are several. Edward Edinger did some great lectures on Faust and alchemy, but other people have pursued this line as well. And I think that's a perfectly legitimate way of looking at it. I think my approach would be to say, well, what is alchemy? When you boil it down, it is about the process of transformation. And it's in that sense that Faust is indeed an alchemical work, because there's so many different examples of transformation that one finds. Well, Faust himself, from the damned individual to the saved individual. Mephisto at one point becomes Phorkys, changes gender identity, and becomes feminine and comes back again. We have figures like Euphorion, who Icarus-like try to fly too high and fall to the earth. You have the transformation of the figure of Homunculus, the little man in the test tube, the kind of proto-test tube baby that we find in part 2, who is transformed and merges with the natural world when his glass phial smashes against the rocks on the festival of the Aegean Sea. There's transformation everywhere you look.
Yeah.
And I think in that sense, one is perfectly legitimate to say, hey, it's an alchemical text because alchemy is about a process of transformation, and in so many different ways, thematic, visual, and as part of the core plot, if you like, of Faust, we see that this of transformation as being the driving idea. So you can certainly try and make individual links between the stages of alchemy and what we find in the play, but for me, it's the underlying theme which is what makes the real alchemical connection. Because the beauty of alchemy is that you don't have to be practicing it in a laboratory with retorts and salamanders, do you? It's got a broader applicability as well.
Right. And you do point out that in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung says that he regarded his work on alchemy as a sign of his inner relationship to Goethe, and that Goethe's secret was that he had been in grip of that process of archetypal transformation, which has gone on for centuries.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful passage, Laura, isn't it? It's just a wonderful summary of what he's doing. And he says, to penetrate into the secret of the personality, that is exactly what Faust wants at the beginning of part 1 as well. To understand what's really going in the world. He says, dass ich erkenne, was die Welt im Innersten zusammenhält, so that I can know what's knitting absolutely at the core of being. In other words, to understand what it is to be alive. And it seems to me that there are so many vital and vitalist links between Goethe and Jung on this idea of the alchemical transformation as being one way of talking about how does one move from what one was to something which is in a different future, that future which constitutes, in that letter to Rickner that we were just looking at, what he calls the most vital present.
And I wanted to say something about the shadow and Mephistopheles being a shadow figure, constellating Faust's shadow. And people talk about, integrating the shadow and working with the shadow, but yet they're so quick to call things evil and say, oh my God, I can't believe he did that. This is in all of us. Yeah. All of this shit that Faust is acting out, that's in all of us. We're all capable of that. Yeah. So anyway, do you have anything to say about that?
I think you've put your finger there, Laura, on the reason why I would say that we are all Faust, because we do all have a dark side as well. It's evidently there in the story of Faust, in what he does to Gretchen. I mean, he seduces her. It isn't just immoral, quote unquote, but it's leading an individual to the. Because of the illegitimate child, and because he gives her a sleeping potion which ends up killing the mother, and so on. So you have someone who ends up brought really to the very edge of existence. Somebody who's going to be condemned to death for what they've done, for murder and infanticide, and it's that's what I find so incredibly powerful about the Gretchen story. Is it isn't simply how quaint for people who've had these moral convictions at one stage. It's a human tragedy. It's the destruction of someone who is young and innocent and beautiful, and who we see in the final scene condemned to death in a dungeon. And what Goethe invites us to contemplate is that is somehow acceptable as part of Faust's redemption. So we really are in immensely murky moral and theological waters here. And Goethe doesn't make it any easier for us. We just can't say, oh, well, there we go. In fact, that's what Mephisto says. In fact, there's one of the most chilling lines in the entire play. And it's so simple linguistically, but so disturbing. That's when Mephisto when Faust is saying, this is terrible what's happened to Gretchen and I'm responsible for it, Mephisto says, sie ist die erste nicht. She isn't the first one. And you see there in this phrase exposed the utter callousness of Mephisto to the fate of a human individual. So I think the shadow is there, not simply as a kind of easy psychological category that one can apply, but actually we explore that shadow in ways which are quite devastating.
This sense in which we are all Faust today, that's reminding me of an upcoming episode that I'll be doing in March with the great-granddaughter of L. Frank Baum, who wrote The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. And there is a new movie out about Dorothy. And she said that the analyst that I'll be interviewing on Speaking of Jung, her name is Gita Dorothy Morena. She said, in a sense, we're all Dorothy. So I can't wait to talk to her about that. So
that sounds a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, when I came across that, in a sense, we're all Faust and we're all Dorothy. So just looking through here to see if there was anything else. Oh, I'd like to ask you about what Jung carved at Bollingen. The phrase.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. That's a good way of pulling this together, because over the entrance to the tower in Bollingen, and then I think he moves it when he adds further bits to the structures at Bollingen. He puts up a little inscription in Latin, Philemonis Sacrum Fausti Penitentia. So the shrine of Philemon, the repentance of Faust. Very gnomic, very mysterious, but clearly wrapped up with Goethe in two respects. First of all, the idea of the penitence of Faust, penitence or repentance of Faust. At the shrine of Philemon, well, that's where things get interesting, or even more interesting, because Philemon is a figure in the end of part 2 who, with his wife Borkis, is put to death at Faust's behest in order that he can get the little parcel of land where they have their small cottage and their small little church chapel with a bell whose ringing drives Faust mad. But of course, you can't say Philemon without thinking about the Jungian Philemon, right, as well. And so I think we have a whole series of questions which are bound up with this inscription. The repentance of Faust. Why is it that when he's talking in Memories, Dreams, Reflections about the murder of Philemon and Borkis, why does Jung say, "Well, I felt guilty for what had happened"? It's a curious thing, because at the end of the day, these are literary figures rather than people. So this idea of them having a kind of representative status, it seems to me, suggests itself, and Jung's sense of guilt, well, for what exactly, I think remains not entirely clear. And what is the relationship between this Philemon, the Goethean Philemon, which, by the way, is also a quotation from Ovid in the Metamorphoses? What is the relation between Philemon and Borkis in Ovid, Philemon and Borkis in Faust Part 2, Philemon and Borkis in the Red Book, in the chapter called the Magician, and then, as it were, Jung's Philemon as well? We can see just how complicated and interwoven this reception of Goethe is. I think I'd say that Jung isn't just an important step in the reception of Goethe and the reception of Goethe's Faust. It's also a way of trying to think the legend on, trying to dream the mythology further. And it's at once immensely revealing about the way Jung feels about Goethe, as well as retaining something of the mystery that we will never entirely know what was going on in this dialogue between these two minds. And this is one of the things why I think which every time one looks at it, one discovers something new, something fresh in this extraordinary relation between Goethe and Jung. But it's also, I think, helps us explain why in the Red Book we can see that Jung is having resource to artistic means, to literary means, to visionary and imaginary means, in order to make sense of some of the problems that he finds Goethe has left him as a legacy, including the question of moral responsibility for the age in which one finds oneself as well, which is a big theme in the early chapters of the Red Book.
What do we know about the life of Goethe, his personal life?
We know quite a lot. There is a book which is sort of day by day through Goethe's life. It's remarkably well documented. We have his diaries, we have his letters, his correspondence with large number of correspondence. The letters between him and Schiller, I think one would say, are probably some of the most important. Fascinating intellectual relationship between Goethe, we might say the extrovert, Schiller the introvert. Jung, of course, very interested this in his chapter on Schiller and Goethe in psychological types. He devotes an entire chapter to their correspondence, of course. Yeah?
Right.
So we are able to follow Goethe through in a great deal of detail. But I think it's interesting that when he's giving his own account of his life in Dichtung und Wahrheit, that's a book which is called Poetry and Truth. His own autobiography he could describe as poetry and truth. And I think you can see the way this is going to go, because, of course, what do we have when Jung sits down with Frau Jaffe, to write his autobiography, as it were, we have memories, and we have dreams, and we have reflections. We have, you might well say, poetry. And I think once we look at the Jaffe protocols, which are out just in time for Christmas, I think we'll see just how much that continues to be true as well from the material that was left on the cutting room floor. I bet you.
Well, I think that's a great place to end it, Professor Bishop. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us today. I'm deeply appreciative of it. And I'd like to ask you, if it's not too burdensome, about Volume 3 and when we can expect that. I mean, are you working on it now? Is it finished?
I am working on it right now. I'm meant to be getting the manuscript in before Christmas. It's been great working with Chiron on Volume 1 and now Volume 2. They've done a beautiful job of it, and so I'm looking forward to continuing to collaborate with them and get the volume on Jung and Nietzsche's Zarathustra. Hopefully not too far before Christmas, out of a concern they don't have that on their desks when they come back in the new year. But Chiron have been absolutely great to work with. So,
that's good to hear.
I'd be keen to keep the relationship alive with them. But thank you for the questions that you've asked. Thank you for sharing your own interest and passion for Jung and Goethe in this way. And I hope that the book will encourage people to, even though it is a big ask and it is a challenging text, I think it's enormously enriching. And the whole idea of writing these books is to get people to think, actually, maybe I should go read Parsifal. Maybe I should go read Faust and should read Zarathustra. That's the ambition, and it's great to be able to share that with you, because I think you're on a similar missionary ambition as well with your podcast, Speaking of Jung. So very glad to have been part of it.
Yes, thank you. And also the journey of transformation, which I appreciate you accompanying me on. And again, the title of the book is Jung and the Epic of Transformation, Volume 2, Goethe's Faust as a Text of Transformation. And you mentioned that you're going to be getting the manuscript for Volume 3 into Chiron before Christmas. When can we expect a release?
So I hope that will come out at some stage in 2026. I know that Kyron have got a lot of other books that they're incredibly active and productive.
Yes.
So it will be. I know I don't know how to do it, but it'll be out some stage in 2026. So watch this space. It won't be too long, I hope.
Okay, and we'll have you back to discuss.
I'd be delighted to do so. Thank you.
Nietzsche and Zarathustra. Thank you again, Professor Bishop. So we'll see you then.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. Take care, Laura.
Speaking of Jung is not just a podcast, it is also a website. Please visit speakingofjung.com, where you will find extensive information on the life and work of C.G. Jung, show notes, and audio downloads for all of our 174 episodes, a comprehensive books page, a blog, and now a monthly email newsletter, which you can sign up for at the bottom of our front page. All of our episodes are also available on YouTube podcasts, which you can access by subscribing to this channel, Jungian Laura. It's free. Just click the subscribe button below. And I neglect to mention that Speaking of Jung is also available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. I created Speaking of Jung over 10 years ago, and all of our content is still free to access, but it is not free to produce. Please consider contributing to our tip jar on Patreon for just $5 a month, or visit our support page at speakingofjung.com/support for links on all the ways you can help keep this podcast and our website alive. So with special thanks to Chiron Publications, I am Laura London, and you've been watching a very special video edition of Speaking of Jung.